All right, we're live. Oh, and we got somebody here. Who's here? Can you hear me? Please respond in the chat. Okay. It looks like we've got several attendees here. Can anybody hear me? Please just type me a message and let me know that the sound is okay before we get going. Okay, good. Good. Thank you, Candace and Alana. I'm going to give this about a couple minutes here. See if anybody shows up a couple minutes late, since we kind of opened the room a little bit late. And if nobody else shows up, then that's fine. We'll just start without people. And if anybody else comes along, that's great. Okay. Well, let's get started then. If you know me, if you don't know me, I'm Stephen Brownlow. Whether you know me or not, I'm still Stephen Brownlow, and what we're going to talk about tonight is how people change. And if you remember from the place you signed up, probably there's sort of four things that we're going to talk about tonight. Probably not in this order, but we're going to talk about why people get stuck. We're going to talk a little bit about how people get unstuck, because that's really a question of reverse engineering why people were stuck to begin with. And then we're going to talk about why most therapy doesn't really get people unstuck the way we'd like it to. And maybe the most important part of it, which is what we have to assume to make all of this work. And that's really where I'm probably going to start. So actually, before I start there, there's sort of a way that webinars are always set up. Traditionally, at least the webinars I've been to have all been set up this way, where the webinar host will come in and they tell stories about themselves and brag about how they're multimillionaires and best friends with Oprah Winfrey and all of this kind of junk. And then they give you about 30 or 45 minutes of either something that you could read on the internet, or some incredibly deep dive into something incredibly narrow and inconsequential, and then send you to their slick sales page and tell you to sign up for their program and all this kind of stuff. And I'm just going to say, if that's what your idea of a webinar is, then I'm going to disappoint you, because we're not doing any of that way. I am going to start out talking a little bit. This is going to be about ideas. And unfortunately, I don't really believe in information. I don't believe in information products so much, because I think it's like self-help books. I think people who read them sometimes get a little better for a little while, but it really, there's more involved to it. And if people could get it on their own, they would get it on their own. Having said that, just by the nature of this being a webinar, it's going to be more information based. It's not going to be as experiential as it would need to be to actually cause the kinds of change that I like to see happen. But I want you to at least understand an outline for how those things can and do happen. So let me start by talking a little bit about why I got interested in this. And somebody had raised this topic the other day about, well, boy, that's an interesting thing, and I'm really interested in how people change. And it's like, it was another therapist, and I thought, wow, gee, I think, shouldn't all therapists be interested in how people change? That seemed like a confusing comment to me, but okay, that's fine. This is something that, and I really started tracing this back as I thought about doing this presentation, and I really trace it back to the fall of 1984, actually. I mean, I can trace it to, because it was a semester that I started my first graduate program. The way I signed up, I enrolled in it by accident, I want to say, or I enrolled in it because I wasn't clear about things as I should have been. I sort of assumed that psychologists were psychologists, and if you had a doctoral degree in psychology, that you got to practice as a psychologist. And I was really interested in why people did what they did and how people worked. I wasn't but by then I'd already realized also that all the theories about people and why people did what they did, all the personality theories and counseling theories and stuff, were just wrong. They didn't have any empirical support. In fact, the empirical data all said that they were all wrong. There were problems with all of them. There were problems with the assumptions. And so I thought, well, gee, instead of signing up for a counseling psych program, I ought to find out how people work. And so I enrolled in a PhD program in what they called Area 2, which was social personality and developmental psychology. And I thought, well, gee, I can at least find out what the research says. And then when I go and I work with people, I will at least know how people really work. Well, in that first semester, I had 4 classes that I remember. One of them introduced me to research and statistics and helped me learn to understand how to read research and understand whether the research was worth anything or not, and whether the statistics said what the author said they did. That was valuable. The second one was a class in Area 2, and it was really a combination, it was an integration of social psychology and personality psychology, or clinical psychology rather, social and clinical psychology, and there was a lot of stuff about research on clinical problems, and most of it was junk. But what I learned in that class, and I learned from writing the paper in that class, was that the whole and all the clinical theories really had to do with emotion. None of them explained emotion adequately. And if you really wanted to understand what was going on, that you had to understand emotion, which was a big aha moment for me, and led to a lot of the work I did over the years. The third class I took was it was in cognitive psychology, and that's the one I want to kind of focus on right now. And the thing that I remember from that class is that we had a book assigned to us, a little thin paperback, and it was really about critical thinking. And most people get critical thinking wrong. And that was the thesis of the book, is that most people get clinical thinking wrong, that you think that critical thinking is that you just naysay things. You just don't accept anything. And because it doesn't seem like it works, it doesn't seem like it fits. And what the author's point is that no, what critical thinking is, good critical thinking, is that you believe everything. You hear an idea and you accept it, but then you test out all its implications. You stretch it as far as it can possibly stretch logically, and then you test it out to see if it actually holds. So if somebody says that this is a universal law and people always do this, you start looking if you can find situations where they don't do that. For instance, now that fits the way I do things anyway, because I'm somebody who tends to not keep thinking in one box very well. I take an idea from one area and apply it to another area. So I can take some social psych about emotions and apply it to the clinical area, for instance, or take an idea from economics and apply it to psychology, or vice versa. And one of the things I started realizing is that you can take any idea from anywhere and test it out to see if it fits and how far it fits. And sometimes, even if it seems like a crazy idea or it came from a crazy source, if you test it out and it consistently seems to fit, then it probably is a good idea, even if the source was crazy. And so that's going to get me to talking about our underlying assumption. And we're going to really start with that and where the underlying assumption came from. And I'm just have been realizing this in the last month, that all of this sort of fits together if we adopt one assumption. And the one assumption came from a very peculiar place. It came from an audiobook that I was listening to about 6 months ago, maybe. And I should preface this by saying that one of my daughters is writing a novel right now. Then the novel is, well, let's just say it's a little bit odd. And I would consider odd. It's non-scientific for certain. It's about past lives and between lives and stuff like this. And so she was listening to all this stuff, and she's played this game of sort of believing and what ifing. And so she's very into a lot of things right now that I wouldn't say there's any real scientific data for, crystals and those kinds of things, moon women kind of spirituality. But this particular audio book was it was written by somebody who was a psychologist, and his specialty was past life regression therapy. Now, I'm pretty agnostic about all of that. I'm not real sure that that matters. But what he had found over time is looking at people who said they'd experienced all these past lives, and he talked about their between lives. And as it turns out, they gave a pretty coherent response to his questions that was very clear and very much uniform between the bunch of them. And it was all about how loving things were. Everything was love, and there was just this overwhelming sense of love and joy and peace. And then coming to Earth was a shock, because things were not that way. Even when people knew that they'd had several lives and they knew what to prepare for, it was still a shock when they got here. Now, I don't know that, I mean, the fact that everybody said the same thing doesn't mean it's true. And the psychologist definitely pointed that out. But I think that's the assumption, that if we start with the assumption that people, when they're born, they want to be loving and they expect other people to love them in return. If we start with that assumption, then everything else makes sense. Because what happens is inevitably, I mean, we all have families, and some of them are traumatic. Some of our experiences are traumatic. Sometimes our parents don't love us. Sometimes our siblings don't love us very much. But even if we have wonderful, near perfect parents, the reality is that sometimes we're going to expect to be loved, and mom is busy trying to get dinner on the table, and if she doesn't stir this right now, it's going to burn. Or the dog just threw up on the floor. Or sister's having a problem and I've got to go deal with her and I don't have time right now. Let me get back to you in 5 minutes. And there are all these little ruptures where we're expecting to be loved and we're not loved. And what the research has shown is that we first start feeling the effects of those ruptures around the time that we experience stranger anxiety, which is different for different kids. It's like 5 or 6 months old for some, it's like 12 months old for others, but most of the time it's around 9 or 10 months. We start experiencing that then, but we don't really have the cognition to understand what it means until our frontal lobes start coming online when we're about 3.5 or maybe 4. And that's when we develop this sense of there's something wrong with me. I'm unlovable. There's something about me that's just awful, which we then defend. But even before that, and that's when we talk about shame, we're talking about that cognition, but we're really talking about that feeling, which is much more primitive and has been there much longer. I think most people will, so far they'll follow me, I think. I'm going to tell you, though, that that's not where people get stuck. It's not how people get stuck exactly. People don't get stuck at the idea that I'm not being loved. Where they really get stuck is the feeling or the decision, I would say, that if you're not loving me when I want it, then I'm going to withhold from you. I'm not going to love you. If you're not going to love me the way I want, then I'm not going to love you the way you want. And that's a very early decision for a lot of people, but that's where people get stuck. And especially as adults, we don't need other people's love as much as we need to love other people. That's really where our growth comes from. We're not doing them favors by loving them. We're allowing ourselves to grow. Unfortunately, because of this pain, this I'm unlovable, I'm unworthy, I have to defend that kind of feeling that we've got, that we're scared of, and we're scared other people are going to find out about. We defend ourselves against expressing that love, experiencing that love, living out that love in its fullness. And so we keep ourselves stuck. That's how people get stuck. Now, getting unstuck, how people change, is really reversing all of that. What people have to do to change, when change happens, is when people get to the bottom of those feelings and realize that they're not, in fact, unlovable. And they can relax those defenses enough that they can allow themselves to risk loving people, risk loving the people that they think have disappointed them, risk loving other people outside themselves. That's a mouthful. That's very difficult to get people to do that. That's not something that people can generally decide to do without help. Those defenses are pretty much unconscious. And by pretty much, I mean they're very automatic. They do a very good job of keeping us from experiencing those feelings of being unloved until they're so strong that they just beat us over the head one more time, maybe a little stronger than they did the last time. But then we immediately distract and avoid and try to move on and try to do other things. The work is really when those times hit, to dive in. And typically you have to know how to dive in and when to dive in. And if you don't really know what's going on and you don't understand what your emotions are telling you, it can be incredibly difficult unless you've got somebody there to help you. So now we get to the sort of our fourth point. And the fourth point is, why does therapy generally not work? Not the way we want it to. And to understand that, I really need to talk a little bit about emotions. As I've come to understand it, they're really, I call them ranges. There's 4 ranges of emotions. And there's really, and when you look at every emotion that there is, you could rank order it from 0 at one end to 1,000 at the other end. It go anywhere in between here. And at the lowest range down here, you've got sort of you could almost call them the victimization emotions, where they're very internalized reactions. They're about you, and you withdraw, and they're very painful. They're the things that typically get people into most therapy. Shame, guilt, alienation, apathy, grief. Those things are very much about me. They're very much about, and I'm pretty much withdrawn from the world. At the top end of that, there's a transition point between that range and the next range. And the transition point is fear. And the next range is above that. And the next range is really pretty much, they're externalized emotions. And they're much more active, and the person's much more engaged in the world, but they're also pretty painful, and they're also, we would say, pretty negative. And those are things like craving and anger and pridefulness. The reason that fear really is the pivot point in that, if you think about fear, you've got externalized fear, where you act on it. You've got fight or flight. But you've got an internalized reaction too. You've got freeze. Freeze is much more like guilt, grief, shame. You're frozen. It's a very much of a parasympathetic reaction. At the higher end of it, you've got fight or flight, which is at least active. That's much more like anger. But you've got those emotions, those externalized emotions, and those are, as I say, defensive. And where the pivot point at the top of that to the next range is courage. Courage is really where you get into the third range. And the third range is what I call the therapeutic range. And it's where we generally consider that most well-functioning adults operate. And so when you look at what's in the therapeutic range, you're looking at things like courage, trust, hope, acceptance, insight. Those are the things that we try to build in therapy. We try to get people to develop hope. We try to to help people develop trust. We try to help people accept what's happened. We try to help them cope with their lives. We try to help them develop insight. The problem with the therapeutic range and the reason that most therapy doesn't work is that it really works in that therapeutic range because most therapists are pretty well functioning adults. The problem is that there's the fourth range above that. And the fourth range begins with love. And it includes joy and compassion and bliss and tranquility and equanimity and ultimately enlightenment. If you go back to why people get stuck because they're not experiencing love and compassion and all of that stuff. They're not getting those things when they want it. But what we're telling them, if we're coming from the therapeutic range, is you've got to learn to cope with it. You've got to learn to accept it. You've got to learn to develop some insight that there's maybe something wrong with you. Or at the very least, that you've been thinking about it wrong and you reached wrong conclusions all along, which is, again, another way of saying that there's something wrong with you or what you've done. What we don't do, what most therapists don't know how to do, is that we don't approach those people with genuine openness, genuine love, genuine compassion, so that they can understand that not only are they not unlovable, but love is all around them, and that they're withholding love from other people. They're withholding love from the world is just an excuse. It's just a way to defend themselves against their vulnerability. Because vulnerability is really not about what's wrong with me. I know there's something wrong with me. I'm sure there's something wrong with me. My biggest vulnerability is letting somebody know that I care about them and putting myself out there where they can reject me and hurt me one more time, just like everybody else has when I put myself out for them. That's how people get stuck. That's how people get better. And that's why therapy doesn't work. Not as well as we'd like it to. Now, there's a whole rationale. There's a whole set of things that can be done that actually do improve things and will make things better. But that takes work on the therapist's part. that takes work individually on our parts to make sure that that change happens. Like I said, it's not something that happens by itself. It's something that we have to author ourselves. Part of it is understanding, as I said, part of it is understanding what I've outlined here briefly. Part of it is understanding how emotions work, including how each of those ranges work, but also how emotions work in general, how emotions get bypassed and how to free those. Because ultimately what we're looking to do is take down those defenses. I used to think for many years that what we were really focused on was freeing the emotional part. I think I'd read too much Freud, I'm not sure. But we make this assumption that once we release the trauma, then that things will be better. I don't think that's true anymore. I think that releasing the trauma is a sign that the defenses have loosened. The real problem is not the emotional part. The problem in the end is the defensive part. Because the defenses not only keep us from feeling unlovable or shamed or whatever, but they also keep us from the kind of very quiet feelings that allow us to understand our life's purpose and meaning. And they keep us from doing and feeling and expressing the kinds of joy and compassion that we say we want. That's the problem. Now, I'm going to take a break here for a second and see if anybody has any questions about what we've talked about so far. I'm not getting any so far. So I'll just move on. That, I told you I was going to talk about 4 things. One of them is how people get stuck, and I believe I've talked about that. One is how people get unstuck and why change happens, and we talked about that. One is why therapy doesn't work as well as we'd like it to, and I've talked about that. And one is the assumption that we have to make it all make sense. And we've talked about that. So I've really kind of talked about the things that I said I was going to talk about, there's just sort of one more thing that I feel like I ought to talk about, and that is to mention um, what people in any situation like this. There's always sort of a what should you do next, and what do I think you ought to do next? I'd say if you've been listening to me by now, I basically, when people listen to me, there are three reactions that people have. One is, wow, you're really speaking to me. I really think I ought to work with you. One is, Brownlow, you are so full of crap. I wouldn't work with you if you were the last person in the world. And the third one is, well, I'd like to work with you, but, and then there's some reason, something. I'm going to say, if you're in the first group, if you think, well, you ought to just, I really think I ought to work with you, I think you ought to listen to that. In just right now, email me. Just return the email to where you got it's sgbrownlow@adeptpsychology.com, but it's where the messages for this webinar came from. I'll get them. And that's fine. If you're in the second group and you think I'm full of crap, then I think you ought to listen to that too. Because I think if you did anything with me, you'd be upset. If you're in the third group and you think, well, I'd like to do something, but I don't have time, I don't have money, I need to talk to somebody, there's a million other things going on. I think you need to look at that. I think you need to look at yourself, actually. If you think you ought to work with me, but then you ought to consider working with me. And you ought to look at what the excuses are about. I'm going to say there's sort of two ways that I could work with you. And I think either one of them, you would have to know which of these would fit for you. If either one is that I do training programs, and what I talked about today is sort of the bird's eye overview of one of them. It's sort of a beginning training program. It's an 8-week online training program that gets into all of this much deeper. Talk about emotions, and we talk about how to do things. And part of that is designed for you to apply some of this stuff to people that you see. If you see people in therapy, or you have somebody, and it's not so much designed to change people, it's designed to just observe people and see how this stuff is manifested in people all around you. And part of it is designed for you to look at this stuff in your own life. And I've had people go through that initial training program who have actually made some remarkable changes in their own lives because they started recognizing some of their own patterns and coming up with some different ways of being and different ways of reacting, because as they started realizing things and they started looking at their own old emotional stuff and what they were avoiding and what they were drawn to, it really started melting away some of their defenses. I remember one lady who was in my first program who went as far as to say that she had gone to a park. She had gone through this whole thing and had spent a couple days really kind of thinking about this kind of stuff. And when it kind of she got to the end of it and she started crying and she did all this stuff and she got out and she went to this park, and she'd gone to this park 2 or 3 times a week for months, I think. And she went to this park. She was just kind of walking through the park and she noticed how green everything was. She'd never noticed how vivid the green was in this park before. That's the kind of thing that happens when people's defenses start melting away. So people do make some personal changes, and they get sort of an overview of exactly how to go about making these changes in other people. And so if that's something you're interested in, that program is actually starting next week. And I'm taking applications for that right now. The cost of that is $500. It's 8 weeks. As I said, it's most primarily video, but there's a lot of interaction with me. There's a community and there's a lot of interaction, because I'm not interested, as I said, I'm not interested in giving you information. I'm interested in making changes. That's one option. The other option that I would suggest, if you're interested in working with me and you're more interested in your own personal stuff than in helping other people, at least right now, I do experiential coaching with people. And again, that is, it's online, it's using Skype. Typically what I do with that is I do that by the hour. And my general hourly rate is $185 an hour. But if you are interested in that and want to do that and send me an email about that, then I would be willing to negotiate a package with you where we could package together 6 or 10 sessions at a substantial discount, and potentially get a lot done. So that's everything that I really wanted to talk about. I think that if you've listened so far, you know whether you want to work with me or not. You may have questions. If you have questions, feel free. If you have questions now about anything I presented, please feel free to ask. I'll stay here for another little while. I had blocked off a good hour and a half, and we're at about 49 minutes right now. But I kind of sped through a lot of this stuff. Well, I'll give everybody about a few minutes to come up with anything, if there's any questions. You're welcome, Alana. Thanks for the compliment on the bookshelf, Candace. I saw that earlier, but yeah, I've got, there's actually 3 bookshelves behind me. They're my, I think my what, why, and how bookshelves, I think I call them. Okay. Well, it looks like we don't have any questions so far, so I guess I'm going to end this and thank everybody very much for attending. Y'all have a good evening or morning, or depending on when you're listening to this and where you are.